The Buffalo Walmart lot once looked like a dealership for Ontario minivans. Tonight, it's just, an empty grid under those sodium lights. No crowds, no cross-border coupon hunters, just wind-snapping plastic cart corrals. 2 months into 2025, tens of thousands of Canadian day trippers are missing from northern U.S. retail corridors. And county treasurers who built budgets on their receipts are staring into holes they can't patch with snow salt or library cuts. Erie County's early year sales tax take came in roughly $5 million short of expectations. That was before the winter thaw, and before Washington escalated the tariff talk. There was no viral hashtag, no border blockade. Canadians just, stopped showing up. Border vehicle counts at Peace Bridge and Rainbow Bridge fell sharply year over year in February and March 2025, stripping toll revenue and those weekend retail spikes. In Blaine, Washington, Target trimmed a full part-time shift linked to falling northbound traffic. In Buffalo, Walmart rolled back weeknight hours to 8 p.m. from a pre-pandemic 10 p.m. Location analytics firms tracking mobile devices show double-digit traffic erosion across several U.S. border format big boxes. Quiet behavior is hitting louder than loud protest. Gas forecourts along I-190 that once sold cheap fill-ups to Canadians now move about one-third fewer liters on peak weekends, according to operators interviewed by local broadcast outlets. A Peace Bridge motel cut rates 15% and still sits at around 38% occupancy. A souvenir stand that lived off late return shoppers fired 3 night clerks. None of these firms had political messaging. All of them had Canadian customers. Retail dependency chains, fuel, lodging, novelty, food were more exposed to cross-border habit shifts than most municipal models assumed. That miscalculation now, feeds layoffs. Erie County's 2025 budget penciled in a $22.7 million shortfall against prior sales tax projections, only 2.1% on paper. But by mid-February, actual collections ran roughly 7% below the prior year pace, deepening the gap. If the shortfall rate persisted across the county's roughly $585 million annual share, finance staff warned the hole could approach $41 million, nearly 80% of what the county typically reserves for winter road clearing. When lake effect snow meets revenue compression, modest stops being modest. So, why the retreat? Well, arithmetic is one culprit. The Canadian dollar has hovered near 73 cents US as of late June, which basically makes US sticker prices about 37% higher when you convert to Canadian currency. Then, you add in bridge tolls, about $8 cash if you don't have a discount program, plus fuel, which can top 100 Canadian dollars just to fill up a family van for the round trip. And honestly, you've eaten up most of the expected savings before you even touch a shopping cart. But the real margin killer hits on the way home. If you go over your traveler allowance, Canada's retaliatory 25% surtax on designated U.S. origin goods kicks in. And in a lot of provinces, there's a 13% HST layered on top. So yeah, that bargain? Pretty much erased. Now consider a $55 Canadian trip line item. Let's say a roughly $40 US-made cosmetics kit. If you're over the limit, you've got to tack on about $10 in surtax, tax conversion, and inspection processing. By the time that item clears Fort Erie, your deal ends up costing more than just buying local. And this isn't just cosmetics, right? Across a bunch of categories: personal care, small appliances, branded snacks, the deadweight cost of exchange, tolls, and surtax now totally flips price competitiveness in those routine shopping carts. So for a lot of families, the switching threshold isn't even political anymore. It's just driven by the math. Domestic chains wasted no time. Walmart Canada, for example, announced across-the-board price actions on hundreds of staple items on June 16, 2025, positioning itself as the low-cost alternative. No border drive needed. Meanwhile, Loblaw, Metro, and Sobeys rolled out limited-term price freezes on key grocery lines, turning what used to be the Buffalo Run into a win in the neighborhood aisle. By flooding flyers with local savings, Canadian grocers have captured the kind of arbitrage that used to belong to U.S. warehouse clubs. Behavioral data is showing us that intent really is becoming habit. Intent survey data reveal that this psychological shift is starting to stick. dunnhumby's 2025 Wave 10 Consumer Trends Tracker reports that about 71% of Canadians plan to cut their U.S. food purchases this year, and roughly 1 in 4 describe this change as something long-term. Modeled spend reallocation suggests we could see 15 to 20 billion Canadian dollars in annual purchasing power moving away from U.S. shelves if these behaviors hold. And then, Angus Reid polling adds another layer. 78% say they'll favor Canadian-made goods, and 59% are willing to avoid products that are clearly branded as American. So when you add up attitude, convenience, and cost, you get a real risk that this switch could last. Pride-driven purchasing is moving from just a slogan to what's actually showing up on store shelves. Local identity retail is now cashing in on this intent. According to CBC reporting from July 2025, Maker House in Ottawa, a shop that sells Canadian-made furniture, snacks, and apparel, has seen sales jump 150% back in February, when President Trump ramped up tariff threats, and those sales are still about 80% higher than the previous year. Customers are asking where products come from, staff are tagging shelves with Made in Canada markers, and even novelty chocolate bars wrapped in Canadian slang are outselling US imports. Emotional substitution is actually shaping inventory decisions. Alright, stop the tape for a second. The silent boycott we've been following in those empty parking lots has just set off a macro-level reaction. Washington is ramping up tariffs, Canadian consumers are redirecting their spending, local US border economies are taking a hit. But on the national level in the US, the numbers barely move, at least so far. Here's the contradiction. You've got headline-making outrage in DC, real pain in places like Buffalo, but the national impact is still pretty muted, even as the political symbolism keeps growing. So now we need to figure out what's real, what's maybe being blown out of proportion, and where the next big fracture might show up. Internal benchmarking at major US retailers flags concentrated risk. Analysts at Barclays reviewing geo-clustered sales warn that up to 28 US border format stores across Walmart and Target are now on performance watch. If Canadian origin traffic stays depressed through year-end, combined top-line revenue attrition could reach about $1.6 billion US dollars. That's small relative to total corporate sales, but honestly, it's pretty large when you look at those thin-margin regional footprints. Retailers designed these stores around currency arbitrage shoppers. Now, the arbitrage has flipped. Food service followed retail down. Polls from NPD Group datasets and county tax receipts show McDonald's, Wendy's, and Burger King combined lost an estimated $350 million US dollars in first quarter 2025 sales within roughly 25 kilometers of the Canadian border. Some franchised operators deferred equipment upgrades. Others cut overnight drive-through staffing. Meanwhile, Canadian chains like Mary Brown's Chicken, Freshie, and A&W Canada absorbed redirected demand without bridge friction or duty limits. Fast food is where sentiment meets habit, and honestly, it's where the switch happens fastest. Electronics, long a cross-border magnet, are softening. Apple's Walden Galleria location logged about 25% fewer device check-ins versus early year comparisons amid tariff chatter and exchange drag. Best Buy near Niagara trimmed weekend Genius Bar hours. On the Canadian side, Amazon.ca expanded same-day fulfillment across the Ontario-Quebec corridor, and Shoppers Drug Mart rolled out 2-hour prescription delivery in 22 metro areas. When logistics shrink to doorstep speed, border arbitrage loses another pillar immediacy. Luxury retail, once assumed tariff resilient, is actually registering domestic share gains. Trendex North America data show Canadian designer sales are up about 4.2% in 2024, and both Holt Renfrew and Simons have now surpassed Saks Fifth Avenue in revenue per square foot within their domestic market footprint. Meanwhile, just across the line in New York State, a Gucci outlet that typically serves cross-border traffic is reporting weekend visits, down roughly 60%, which has forced them to stagger staffing in order to avoid layoffs. Even affluent shoppers, it turns out, are not immune to friction. They just tend to defect a little later. Membership warehouses. Loyalty under strain. Membership economics really depend on renewal momentum. SEC filed swipe card aggregates from both Costco and Sam's Club show Canadian-linked renewals at 5 major border warehouses are down about 11.8% year over year. That's revenue lost, twice, fewer dues, and fewer bulk baskets. One Costco executive even told investors the chain is, quote, reevaluating the border warehouse model. Traffic no longer covers rising labor. Fixed cost formats just hate volume shocks, and cross-border volumes are definitely shock-prone. On July 10, 2025, President Trump floated a 35% tariff on Canadian goods during remarks that were carried by both Canadian and U.S. outlets framing Ottawa as taking advantage. But instead of intimidating anyone, that rhetoric actually reinforced consumer resolve. According to CBC's travel analysis, June Canadian land trips to the U.S. are down about 33%, and air travel is down roughly 22% year over year. Several professional conferences have even shifted their venues to Canadian cities just to sidestep U.S. border screening volatility. The harder the line from Washington, the stickier the local shift appears to be. So here's a complication that honestly muddies the whole boycott math. Many so-called American grocery brands you see in Canada are actually bottled, baked, or processed right here, domestically. According to reporting from CNBC at Canadian grocers, things like Coca-Cola are bottled in Ontario, and Frito-Lay uses Canadian potatoes. Once shoppers started rejecting anything they thought was US-made, companies even changed packaging to highlight the local origin. The contradiction is pretty clear. Consumers try to punish US labels, while multinationals just localize production to dodge that sentiment. In the end, boycotts might redirect some spending, but they don't totally remove upstream US corporate revenue. When it comes to alcohol, policy, not just preference, made the biggest difference. Several provinces actually pulled US alcohol from government-controlled store shelves earlier this year. On top of that, Ottawa slapped on a 25% tariff on US alcohol products, making the impact even bigger. In 2024, US exporters sent about $435 million in wine, $221 million in spirits, and about $41 million in beer to Canada. Those gaps were filled by imports from France, South Africa, Australia, and local craft producers. The categories hit by tariffs saw the sharpest import collapses. Solid proof that policy changes have a much bigger impact than just consumer gestures. Economist Trevor Tom, writing for The Hub on June 25, 2025, took a close look at customs data. Canadian imports of U.S. goods that were hit with tariffs fell by about 43% year over year in April, while non-tariffed U.S. goods slipped only around 8%. The big takeaway: it's those retaliatory tariff lists, not broad consumer boycotts, that really drove the measurable drop in trade. For the U.S., April's decline in tariffed imports was about $3.8 billion. Definitely significant for exporters, but pretty trivial compared to a $30 trillion US GDP. So the national pain is modest, but the local pain, that's concentrated and political. And honestly, that tension is what shapes policy risk. Global Echo Europe watches. Canada isn't alone in signaling fatigue. After President Trump's remarks about annexing Greenland, European polling cited by regional trade analysts found that about 44% of surveyed consumers were shifting away from U.S. products on sentiment grounds. Auto data show Tesla's European registrations were down about 28% in May, marking the 5th monthly decline amid competitive pressure and brand politicization. The cross-border lesson really scales. When policy rhetoric contaminates consumer identity, discretionary imports start to become referendum votes. Tourism deficit and free money lost. International visitation compounds the goods story. U.S. travel industry trackers estimate the country is on pace to forfeit about $12.5 billion in inbound visitor spending in 2025 versus last year. With softness tied to visa friction, security screening, and trade tensions. Industry advocates note that inbound tourists bring money, leave quietly, and advertise the destination back home. A pure services surplus. Letting perception drag down visitation while chasing merchandise tariff wins is a lopsided trade strategy. So, does the Canadian wallet revolt actually hurt the US? At the national level, current data suggests the macro drag is honestly pretty small. But that answer kind of misses the real policy pressure point. Border counties, franchise districts, and labor pools that are feeling the pinch. They vote, they lobby, and yeah, they definitely amplify. Just a handful of shuttered big box anchors can totally redefine rural employment bases. And, reframe trade narratives in those election media cycles. Localized economic stress often outruns its statistical weight in Washington debates. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government has so far maintained Canada's retaliatory tariff roster and even widened those by Canadian procurement nudges in selected federal supply contracts, according to public procurement notices. Ottawa hasn't exactly called for a consumer boycott, but every surtax, label program, and provincial shelf decision just lowers the frictions to buying Canadian instead of US goods. Policy scaffolding plus emotional response. Well, that equals structural shift risk. Here's the loop. The US pushed tariffs to shrink deficits. Canadian consumers retaliated with avoidance. US localities most dependent on Canadian spend saw revenue stress. Washington floated steeper tariffs, which only reinforced the avoidance. Meanwhile, multinational US brands localize production in Canada to preserve share, diluting the very trade lines tariffs were supposed to influence. Policy designed to punish imports is, kind of ironically, encouraging import substitution and supply chain relabeling. From Buffalo parking lots to federal trade ledgers, billions in Canadian consumer dollars have quietly rotated home. National US GDP barely flinches, but regional retail ecosystems are cracking, and brand America is absorbing sentiment bruises that don't show up in customs codes until habits harden. If Washington wants those wallets back, it won't be coupons. It's going to be predictability, respect at the border, and a tariff ceasefire structured with data, not applause lines. Until then, the sound you hear at 8 p.m. outside a border town Walmart is nothing at all. That silence is money that used to be American. We're glad you're enjoying this video. Please like and subscribe. Check out another video that is now on your screen.